Welcome to Office Hours, hosted by legendary sports executive, entrepreneur, and investor David Meltzer, where the brightest millionaires, billionaires, and entrepreneurs in business, sports, and entertainment get together to talk about success, failure, and everything in between. Take a deep dive into the mind of some of the world's most impactful guests. David Meltzer hosts Office Hours. I'm excited to hear from our next guest, Gregg Ficery, founder and president of Integra Valuation and Advisory, author of Gridiron Legacy, Pro Football's Missing Origin Story.
Welcome to Office Hours. I'm David Meltzer, and we get to talk about two of my favorite things with Gregg Ficery, money and football. And the Gridiron Legacy book, meanwhile, the foreword by Franco Harris, and so I wanted to give a big shout out and honor one of my dear friends who we lost this year. But I'm from Akron, Ohio. Canton, Ohio is supposedly the birthplace there in Ohio, supposedly in Stark County, but this book tells the truth. Most people may not remember Paul Harvey. When I look at this book, here's the rest of the story about my favorite sport, my family's favorite sport. Gregg, how long did it take you to figure out all of these things that were missing from the Pro Football Hall of Fame, the real story?
It took every bit of 15 years to produce this book. The first half, probably 7, 8 years, was research and organizing, and then the second half was accepting the fact that I was going to write it instead of somebody else, and then learning as a first-time author how to approach that and get the confidence to pull it off. And then ultimately, the fun part was laying out the beautiful photos that I inherited.
But there had to be something that stimulated that there was something missing, right? You had to go down the rabbit hole of 15 years. What was it that first sparked your interest that, wait a second, the history of football is all wrong?
It was a family lore story, ultimately. My great-grandfather, Bob Shiring, was the captain of the 1906 world champion Massillon Tigers pro football team before the NFL. And so you mentioned that the common story is that Canton is the birthplace of pro football. They actually call themselves the cradle of pro football. So there's a little nuance there that is a red herring and throws people off. And so that's something, one thing that is kind of missing or most people don't understand. Pittsburgh, where I grew up, is actually the birthplace of pro football in 1892.
Which is also interesting. Notice he keeps saying pro football because one of the nuances that helped me in my marketing career was that I knew that the Hall of Fame was the Pro Football Hall of Fame,
right,
not the NFL Hall of Fame. So to get a marketing deal with the Hall of Fame was much easier, even though it was the greatest players of all time, 272 at the time. I knew a little marketing nuance. As you are loving what you do, it tells you all the secrets. Yeah. One of the secrets that I had was that the Clemente Award wasn't owned by Major League Baseball and the Hall of Fame wasn't owned by the NFL. So I could do marketing deals and get them done in a week where nobody with MLB or NFL could get those caliber of opportunities done, sometimes in years.
So there's a lot of opportunities that you can still turn over and discover. And one of those, because of that lack of connection to the NFL, is that the Pro Football Hall of Fame still doesn't have very much information or photographs on the pre-NFL period. And when I took my collection that I inherited to them in 2012, they were just blown away. They said, you have a huge opportunity to do a wonderful book here if you can combine the photos with the narrative that's still largely missing as well, including what I heard from my grandmother growing up was that there was a alleged gambling scandal in 1906 that is kind of a cold case and it's never been solved. So if I could go about and solve that and combine it with the photos, it was something that nobody else had.
Sounds like the next Netflix special I want to watch.
No, it does need to get turned into a story, you know?
Well, thanks for that.
Yeah.
We're working on it.
I mean, let's go. You know?
You're the one to do it.
You've got these two great sides, right? These two great topics, money and football. So I want to dive a little bit into the money side, especially with what your company does, Integra. in terms of helping companies with their valuation. So for new entrepreneurs, startup businesses, what are some key things they can do at the beginning to increase their valuation when it's time to sell, if they choose to?
There's another common thread we have with your 2-minute drill show. I mean, it connects to the Shark Tank type shows. And the best thing that they can do to raise money is first get a decent, reasonable valuation. I mean, we've all seen people get laughed out of a 2-minute drill for having a ridiculous valuation. So, but to improve their valuation, the top thing they can do is have sales. I mean, just some traction, some market viability, and then some experience. An exit or two under the belt always carries a ton of weight.
Well, Gregg, first of all, let me say just thank you for providing such a great gift to big-time football fans. I mean, what a great thing. I can't wait to get my copy.
Thanks.
My question to you, Gregg, is with the evaluation that you've done of all these companies, I think you've done over 1,000, which is pretty amazing. What would you say is the biggest mistake that you've seen entrepreneurs do that costs them a great evaluation?
Maybe a little different flavor that would be starting out with a valuation that's too high, because it really sets them up for failure if they can't deliver on that. So there's a little bit of ego involved in achieving a high valuation, kind of like the sexiness of doing a deal or doing a merger and acquisition, but executing on mergers and executing on starting a business is really hard. And when you get down to the nuts and bolts of it, if you can't fulfill your forecasts, you might be out of a job pretty soon. So you'd rather create a win-win-win situation, what I call, which is like the 3 main constituents in a startup are the founders, the investors, and the employees. So if everybody's equally incented with a reasonable stock option prices and a chance to succeed, then you might get to a successful exit. But if somebody's disadvantaged in that process, nobody will succeed. So I encourage people to raise money at a reasonable valuation to give themselves room to grow and on that.
On that last point, a reasonable sum. Valuing an early stage company is different, as you fully recognize, than valuing a fully profitable organization. So I've got basically 2 questions here. One has to do with what's the difference in valuation? What criteria do you pay attention to in early stage that's not as relevant in a later stage company? And then the second part to that has to do with the reason we value the companies is because we're looking for cash infusion. I mean, it's money. What's the danger in getting too much?
Traditional valuation methods go out the door right away. Yeah, in business school, we learn Finance 101, present value of future cash flows is the value of a business. But if you don't have any cash flows, how do you value a business? You can look at, that's called an income approach. And like a home appraisal, you have an income approach and a market approach where you look at comps, either comparable houses or comparable companies. And those may or may not provide you good data to create a valuation. They're not specific to your own company's performance. So before even a market approach, if you have no revenue, how do you do that? That's an entirely different animal. And given the experience that I had valuing early stage companies at Silicon Valley Bank's valuation group before I started my own company, Integra, in 2011, I got a lot of experience putting my finger on the pulse of the earliest stage companies. And so I've come up with a way called the scorecard method that I've sort of adapted from some academic white papers out there to create a worksheet that I actually go through with clients online, and they have input to it, and they can see in a sort of data-oriented way as much as possible with an early stage company how to break down a valuation based on funding data from tech companies around the country, angel stage companies, and then adjusting that for things like the region where they're raising money, because there are differences between the Valley and, say, the South, where I am, the sector that they're in, the year-to-date adjustment, given that there's a data lag often with the research out there. So there's a a number of factors that have to be considered and to come up with a sensible valuation for a startup. And I think I have a little something different.
Last question, real quick. All four of us want to invest in the movie Gridiron Legacy. What's the valuation?
I might be biased in that
Right.
decision, but we can talk.
Yeah, the problem is the final lesson of valuation is people buy on emotion for logical reasons, and that sometimes gives a false valuation, and we can use that to our disadvantage or advantage. And it's great, though, that you've done the work over 15 years to help us, not only with the book, but also to help companies, over 1,000 of them, to get what they deserve, the value, and be able to articulate the quantitative value of what they're asking for. Gregg Ficery, thank you so much for joining us here on Office Hours.
Thanks for watching this week's episode of Office Hours, and a special thank you to our featured co-hosts and guests for joining today's episode. See you next week on Office Hours.